Thank you, Janelle. Here in just a couple of weeks, on October the 16th, Caroline and I will be celebrating our 10th wedding anniversary. And with that anniversary date looming, I have been thinking a bit back on what it was like on our wedding day and everything that went on relative to the wedding. We had a pretty big wedding, though, and the reason for that was for a few reasons. First of all, Caroline has a lot of family. My family's fairly small. Hers, I don't know, probably 70 or 80 of them that were in attendance. Beyond that, we had essentially 3 churches worth of folks that we had to invite, so we wound up with like 450 people at our wedding. And the challenge with that is figuring out where to have not simply the ceremony, but also the reception. So we had the ceremony at my home church, and trying to find a place indoors where you can have that many people is a challenge. So long story short, we decided we'd have a tent outside, and that way we could accommodate however many people we wanted to, and the tent should take care of us in the event of rain. That being said, we were still kind of concerned because this tent didn't have any sides on it. We were concerned as to what the weather was going to be like. Thankfully, October the 16th of 2004 was a beautiful, beautiful fall day. Just big white puffy clouds in the sky, somewhere in the low to mid 60s. It was an absolutely beautiful fall day. The only problem was that the wind was blowing fairly swiftly. And I remember thinking, it's a great day, but I do wish the wind would kind of die down. But then I came to discover that the wind came to us as a blessing. Here's why I say that. After the wedding ceremony, and I'm still not sure if it's legal, Shep officiated at our wedding, so I don't know, common law, I guess, by now would kick in, but once the wedding ceremony was over, we took pictures, and then we went outside to the reception, started by cutting the cake, and at that point you've got all these people that want to come by and congratulate you. There's this whole line of single women just sobbing and trying to console themselves. But all these people, though, they want to come up and congratulate you and wish you well. And it was so good to see so many people. And you know how those events work. There's folks that have been dear to you, but it's tough to stay in touch on a regular basis. Some of these folks you'd love just to be able to spend hours just kind of reminiscing and catching up. But there's not time for that. It's person after person after person, and we're just inundated. But pretty quickly, I began to notice this crowd is thinning out. Why are people leaving? The food was good. It's beautiful outside. Why were people leaving? Well, once you got in the shade of that tent, that wind was blowing and folks started getting cold. And once they got cold, they would come to speak to us, and then they would walk away and head off to the parking lot, and they would leave. At this point, I began to discover the wind is not that bad of a thing. As a newlywed, well, the reception didn't go on forever. That's what I'll say. All right, this is the thought I want you to get, though. Because of circumstances that were viewed as unpleasant, in this case, the wind, people walked away and left. Because circumstances that were viewed as unpleasant, because people were experiencing those, they walked away and left. That's the thought that I want you to recognize is a form of a tool that Satan wants to use against you and against me. And specifically what I want you to understand is that Satan wants to work through specifically adverse circumstances to get you to the point where you begin to question God, where you begin to get disillusioned with God. Perhaps even reevaluating your commitment to Him, and to get you feeling so miserable that you may get to the point where you've decided, I've had enough of this, and perhaps, just maybe, you'll walk away from Him. Satan, one of the tools in his tool belt that he uses against us collectively and individually is the weapon, the tool of circumstances. Since he's using this against us, it's wise and prudent for us to understand how he's using this. So how specifically does he use this tool against us? If you would open your Bibles with me to Exodus chapter 1. Exodus chapter 1, and we're going to be dropping in at several places in these first two chapters. Exodus chapter 1. Again, what we're thinking about is the fact that Satan is using circumstances in his assault against us. But how exactly is he using them? Well, based on what we are getting ready to see, he does a couple of things. And the first is that he will work to make your circumstances bad. Satan is going to work to make your circumstances bad. Before we start delving into the text, we need a bit of context. And the context for what's going on here actually takes us back into about the middle portion of Genesis. And you remember one of the standout individuals whose lives we are told about in the book of Genesis is one of the heroes of the Old Testament, and specifically of the entire Bible, and it's Joseph. You remember how his brothers hated him. They were so jealous of him. They sold him off as a slave. He winds up in Egypt, and you remember hopefully the story about his rise to power and how God worked to advance him throughout the ranks so that Joseph essentially becomes the prime minister of Egypt. He's number 2 under the Egyptian Pharaoh. You recall also that what's going on back at home for his father and his brothers is that a famine has struck. And there's no food. And short of going to Egypt, they're going to literally starve to death. And so they go to Egypt. They discover Joseph, a son and a brother they thought was dead. But he's not dead. He's alive and well. In fact, he's number 2 in the land of Egypt. And he provides for his father. He provides for his brothers and their families. And as this famine continues to go on, Joseph keeps them there with him, providing for them, caring for them. Consequently, his brothers essentially just set up shop there in Egypt. This becomes, for all practical purposes, their new home. They begin to have children and grandchildren, and increasingly there is this lineage that is stemming from Joseph and his family that is growing more and more numerous in Egypt. Now, all that goes on and leads us up to chapter 1 in Exodus. As we come to chapter 1 in Exodus, Joseph is dead. In fact, the Pharaoh under Joseph is also dead. There's a new sheriff in town. There's a new Pharaoh. And this Pharaoh does not have the affinity for, the relationship with the family of Joseph like the previous Pharaoh did. In fact, he is from an altogether different line completely. The Pharaoh in Joseph's day was from a line of people known as the Hyksos. Not the Hicks, but the Hyksos. And the Hyksos were not native Egyptians. They were essentially foreigners who had come to Egypt, rose to power, and out of them came this Pharaoh. Again, this Pharaoh is dead, and now there's a new Pharaoh who he and his family, his entire lineage, is from Egypt. He is suspect of, and it seems that the nation of Egypt itself is suspect of, as quite frankly nations throughout the course of history have been, relative to those who are not native citizens. Concerned, well, if all these people start coming in, what might they do? What type of decisions might they make? How might they affect the direction of our country? And so, at this point, we're told in verse 7 of chapter 1, the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly, multiplied and grew exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them. So from Joseph's family, Egypt is getting full of these Hebrews, these Jews. Now, in verse 8, we're told that there is a new Pharaoh who arose, and he did not know Joseph. And he says in verse 9, "Look, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And it happen in the event of war that they also join our enemies and fight against us, and so go up out of the land." So the concern is, we need to do something about these people. They're not native Egyptians, but if they decided to work together, especially with our enemies, they could topple the government. They could have their way with this country. They could do whatever they wanted to. They are so numerous. They are so influential. We had better do something. And so the Pharaoh's first plan was pretty simple. Let's make life miserable on them. And so step 1 involved making them slaves. And part of their slave labor was to make and bake bricks. Bricks that would be used for all sorts of government expansions and building projects. Perhaps even including the bricks that comprise the great pyramids that still exist today. And so the Egyptians were brutal taskmasters against the children of Israel, but to no avail. They continue to grow. They continue to multiply. Their ranks are continuing to swell. Well, since that did not work, we're told in verse 15 that the Pharaoh spoke to the Hebrew midwives, of whom the name of one was Shiphrah and the other's name was Puah. These two women, it seems like they're the charge nurses for all the Hebrew midwives. And so they're kind of the folks in a supervisory position. He brings them in, he summons them, and he gives them a command in verse 16. He says, when you do the duties of a midwife for the Hebrew women, and see them on the birth stools, if it's a son, then you shall kill him. But if it's a daughter, then she shall live. It's amazing. A child being born and just happening to be male is a capital offense now. But practically speaking, if this unfolds how the Pharaoh thinks, it will accomplish his goal. He wants to thin their ranks. He wants to stymie their growth. And if he can get rid of all the successive generations of males, then he can accomplish that. So he tells the midwives, that's what you're to do. If a child is born, it's a girl, she can live. But if it's a boy, you're to kill him. So he thinks, okay, this is going to work. But then he starts to notice, and he sees these Hebrew children, and there are little girls, yes, but there's, what's that little boy doing around here? He shouldn't be around. There's all these children, both male and female, and so he brings these two women back in, and I love this in verse 19. And he says, actually at the end of verse 18 you have the question, why have you done this thing and saved the male children alive? I love their response in verse 19. They say, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, they are lively, and they give birth before the midwives come to them. I mean, they're just so spry, they're so fast, their labor is so short. They're just having birth before we can get there, and by that time, it's just too late. Well, we're told then that what happens is that Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, every son who is born you shall cast into the river, and every daughter you shall save alive. So at this point, he's gone beyond commanding these two women. He's gone to commanding the nation, specifically his armies and his henchmen. If there is a male Hebrew child born, that child is to be drowned in the Nile River. Well, what's going on at this point? By the time you get to chapter 2, we're introduced to this young couple, a man named Amram and his wife Jochebed. They already have some daughters, but Jochebed becomes pregnant again. Now, this is obviously thousands of years before the advance and development of ultrasounds. All you knew is you were going to have a baby. She had no idea whether it's going to be a boy or a girl. And given the circumstances of the day, you've got to think she was saying, please, Lord, let this be a little girl. But then she goes into labor, she gives birth, and it's not a little girl. It's a little boy. And now she's looking into the eyes of this newborn infant, thinking this child may very well die for no other reason than he was born. You know, throughout the course of history, I imagine it has probably always been this way, where folks will say, especially middle-aged and above, you know, this is a terrible time for children to be born. I mean, there's so much bad stuff in the world. There's so much evil in the world. There's drugs. There's places in the country or places in the world where you can hardly even breathe the air. It is so polluted. There is all this rampant immorality. There's gangs. There's violence. There's all this stuff. What a terrible, terrible time for a child to come into the world. Now, the truth is, I think virtually every generation has said something like that. But as bad as things may be today, think of how bad this was. That you could have a little boy, and just because that child is born, that becomes a capital offense. So here you have Jochebed, Amram, this young couple. Under normal circumstances, this should be one of the happiest of times for them. Not only do they have a child, they've got a male child that can carry on the family lineage. But now they're scared to death. Frightened, what's going to happen to this little boy? Thinking at any point, at any moment, he might be executed. And at first it would have been pretty easy to hide him. After all, little female and male children, they would have been wrapped and swaddled the same way, and unless someone unwrapped them, they wouldn't know if it's a little boy or a little girl. But with the passage of time, it's going to become evident. And at some point, unknown to Amram and Jochebed, Pharaoh's henchmen could come in, strip them from their child, and take him to the river and drown him. Now think what must have been going through their minds. Absolutely, there had to be fear, anxiety, all sorts of apprehension. But though the text does not tell us this, I think it is absolutely logical and reasonable. In fact, I think it would be illogical otherwise. I think it's certain that Amram and Jochebed spiritually began to have some real and marked questions. God, why is this happening? Not simply to us and our family, but to us as a people. We remember the covenant that you established with Abraham. We remember that you said that we would be as numerous as the sands on the beach. But now we've got a godless pagan that is seeking to prevent that and killing all of our male children. How could you let this happen? Are you still in control? Do you love how we thought you loved? You've got to think that circumstances were getting to the point where they're asking questions like that. And as they're asking these questions, beginning to doubt the power of God, the love of God, the ability of God. And you've got to think that Satan would have been loving those questions. What was he doing? He was seeking to create circumstances, horrible, awful, unmitigatingly miserable circumstances. Circumstances over which the victims had absolutely no control. Jochebed and all of these other young mothers, just like her, they were completely powerless against the Pharaoh, powerless against his decree. They couldn't do anything about this. They couldn't raise an army. They didn't have weapons. They couldn't change the law. They couldn't do anything. Their backs were absolutely against the wall. And Satan is working through this Pharaoh to create some awful, terrible circumstances for the people of God. What he did in Jochebed's day, Satan still does today. Though he does not at all have the power of God, he is nevertheless phenomenally powerful. Jesus said of him in John chapter 12 that he's described as the ruler of this world. Paul describes him in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, the God of this age. Here's the question. Does Satan have the ability to affect the circumstances of your life? You can bet your life on it. Can he affect your circumstances adversely? You bet he can. He certainly did for Amram and Jochebed, and what he has done before then and to them, he continues to do to this day. Can he get control of the lives of others so that they make your life little more than miserable? Sure he can. Can he work through circumstances that even your life and the lives of those that you care for may be imperiled or in danger? Absolutely he can. But what I want you to think about is this. Why would he do that? Why would he do this then? Why would he do something similar today? Well, I believe the answer again is pretty clear. If he can get you so frightened and so miserable, experiencing such grief, such woe, such despair, such disillusionment, maybe, just maybe, you're going to start thinking some real serious spiritual questions. God, are you really in control? Are you really good? Because this is such horrible evil and you're permitting it. You could stop it, but you're not. Do you love like I thought you loved? Do you keep your promises like I thought you did? Satan's goal is to get you in those circumstances to focus ultimately on how bad the circumstances are, so that when you get to that point, you begin to do little more than question God and focus on how horrible the circumstance is. And when he can get you to that point, you will not be thinking about what it is that God can do, what else it is that he's doing, what other blessings it may be that are coming your way. Rather, all he wants you to do is to focus exactly on that you are not getting what you want, what makes you feel safe, what makes you feel happy, what makes you feel comfortable, what makes you feel blessed. You're not getting that. And if you can focus exclusively on that, you won't see anything else. That's his goal. Because then, just maybe, he can get you where maybe you'll turn your back on God. Catherine, our youngest, is 2.5. And so we have been going through this stage with her, the whole potty training business. That's a very exciting time in the lives of us as parents. And Caroline had been negotiating with Catherine over this, and that was that if she would successfully do her homework, we would take her and the boys to go get some ice cream. So we're going to try to bribe her into doing this. And so we've been having, anyway, so that's what we've been doing. Anyway, Caroline calls me the other day to describe that we've had a breakthrough. And she said, I'm going to be taking the kids to McDonald's to get some ice cream. She said, would you like to go? I said, sure, I'll meet you. So we went to the McDonald's up at Bridford and Wendover. And once we got there, we told the kids, you've got 3 options. You can have one of these small McFlurries where they'll put either Reese's Cups, M&Ms, or Oreos in it. You can have a McFlurry, you can have an ice cream sundae, or you can have a chocolate-dipped ice cream cone. Well, Nathan and Catherine both want a McFlurry. In fact, Andrew, our 6-year-old, initially says he wants a McFlurry as well. But then he hears Philip say, I want a chocolate-dipped ice cream cone, and then Andrew switches and says, no, I want that. I want a chocolate-dipped ice cream cone. So we place the order, 2 McFlurries and 2 chocolate-dipped cones. We pay, and then we wait for them to get that ready, and once it's ready, we take it back to the table. We hand Andrew his chocolate-dipped ice cream cone. As soon as Andrew sees it, he says, that's not what I wanted. And he points to what Nathan and Catherine have. He says, that's what I wanted. No, Andrew, what you said, in fact, you said not once but twice, I want a chocolate-dipped ice cream cone. And he begins to argue with us at this point, and you can see the tears beginning to well up. And Caroline says, no. If you cry over getting an ice cream cone, I'm just going to spank you. So at that point, he sucks it up, and he sits there, and he eats this ice cream cone. I assure you, you have never in your life seen a child appear more miserable while at the same time eating ice cream. He had the sternest, most dour expression. And so Caroline and I, as ever the gracious parents, what were we doing? We laughed. We were seated several places over, and we looked at him and watched this, not only in humor, but also in amazement. Here he is. He's got a chocolate-dipped ice cream cone, just given to him. This is a great treat. But can he enjoy it? No. Is he focusing whatsoever on what he does have? No. Why? Because all he can see is what he doesn't. Now, listen, I understand that Satan is going to be working on a much higher level than what type of ice cream you do or do not get. Certainly that was the case with Jochebed, and it's going to be true in your life and in mine. But the same principle, I believe, is going to be in play. And that is that he wants to get you to the point where circumstances are so bad, that is all you can see. That's all you can focus on, that God is not granting to you a reprieve from this circumstance, that He's not bringing healing, that He's not providing that opportunity, that the relationship is on the rocks, that the money is tight, that whatever the circumstance is, so that you begin to question God and you don't see anything else that He is doing, can do, or will do. You won't see any of that. All you can see is just how bad it is. And when that happens, maybe, just maybe, you begin to look towards heaven with a question mark. Should I trust you? I don't know. And maybe, just maybe, because the circumstances are so bad, like our guests at a windy wedding reception, just walk away. Satan, what is he doing? Through circumstances, he will work to make your circumstances bad. But there's a second thing that he does. He will guide you to a crisis of belief. He will guide you to a crisis of belief. So he's going to work to make circumstances terrible and then bring you to a crossroads, to a crisis of belief. As you get to chapter 2, she has had, according to verse 2, this little baby for 3 months. For 3 months, she has been able to successfully hide him. And as she is hiding him, almost certainly she has been actively thinking about, what might I be able to do where I could save my child's life? Is there some sort of law channel? No. Is there some type of military channel? No. I mean, there's really nothing she can do. And so what she decides is, if this child's supposed to be going into the river, I'm going to make a little boat for him. A little ark is what it describes. Wood would have been both very expensive and very rare, so she takes what's available to her, and she takes sheets of papyrus. Well, you're aware that papyrus is not waterproof, and so she layers this, probably uses some sticks to add some structure to this, and since it's not waterproof, she lines it with tar and pitch so that the water cannot get in. And so she's now got this water-worthy, seaworthy little boat. And what seems has occurred is that she has been working on this. She's got it prepared, hoping against hope that she doesn't have to use it. Now, we're not told all the details as to how this whole event transpired, but what my reasonable speculation is that one day there was a surprise raid in their community, in their village. And the Pharaoh's henchmen are coming in to do an inspection, and they're going from house to house, and they're looking to see if they find any male children. And every one that they find, they're taking and tossing into the river so that it can die an excruciating death, a death by drowning, for no other reason than they've been born. What I imagine has happened is that this raid has begun, and maybe she's far enough away from the raiders that she grabs her little baby and she heads out with one of her daughters, Miriam, and she puts this little baby in the water, hoping against hope that somehow, some way, this child's life may be saved. What was she doing in this act? Well, the writer of Hebrews, I believe, illustrates for us what is going on, that she was trusting God. Hebrews 11:23, speaking of this incident, says that this was done by Jochebed in faith. In faith. Ultimately, she had just two options. She could either turn her son over to Pharaoh's henchmen, or she could decide, I'm going to turn him over to God. I'm going to put him in God's hands. Give him to Pharaoh, hoping that someone may feel some grace towards him, or I'll turn him over to God, not knowing exactly what will happen. Again, you've got to think that Jochebed at this point is very much struggling with doubt. Got to think that she was looking towards heaven saying, God, I just don't get this. I think it's an absolute miracle that you've blessed Amram and I with the ability to conceive again and then to give birth to this child. We view our children as miracles from you, but here you've given us this son, but for what? So that we could watch him be cruelly executed? Why? Are you really in charge? Are you really in control? Otherwise, why is this happening? And so finally, she gets to a moment that I can only describe as what I would verbalize as a crisis of belief. And I believe it culminated in one singular moment where she's got this little baby in this raft and she has to let go. She's been thinking about this moment. She's been preparing for this moment. She rushes out with Miriam toward the water's edge with this raft and with her son. But there was that briefest of moments where she had to make a culminating final decision. Am I going to trust God with my child or not? And she let go of her boat. An act that ultimately said, God, I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know how things are going to unfold, but I'm deciding I'm going to trust you. The circumstances were terrible, and they finally culminated in this singular decision where she had to decide, I'm either sticking with him or I'm walking away. I'm going to trust or I am going to abandon him. Satan had been working through these circumstances to get her to that point where she would have to answer that question. And ultimately what he was doing was to make a gamble, betting on the fact that she may turn, betting on the fact that she might abandon God. Understand that you have an enemy in the form of Satan that is alive and well, and he is targeting every single one of us. And he is working through circumstances to turn the heat up on us, on me, and on you, so that you begin to get to the point, the place that you struggle with questions of doubt, doubting the power, doubting the goodness, doubting the ability, maybe even doubting the existence of God. And he's not going to let up. He's not going to leave you alone when you begin to experience this, because he's going to bring this to a culminating decision point where you will ultimately decide, I'm either with him or I'm not. I'm going to trust him or I'm not. What he's banking on, and ultimately this is a gamble by Satan, is that I'm going to make things so bad on you, I'm just betting that you're going to turn from God, because that's his goal. Not to trust him and ultimately to cease following him. I recognize that Caroline has some difficult days on a regular basis. We have 4 children from 2 to 8, and she homeschools our kids. So not only is she a wife and a mother to 4 children, but she's also their school teacher. In addition to being their school teacher, that also makes her the cafeteria worker. It makes her the janitor. It makes her the principal. It makes her all of those things. I'm the superintendent. My office is over here. But the days are long, and dealing with this, that, and the other constantly throughout the day, naturally, it gets to the point where you've given of yourself so much, you've been patient so much, you're just kind of fried, just kind of frayed. And so regularly what I do, being aware of this, is to try to give her just even a little bit of respite, a bit of break where she can just, if she wants to stare at a wall, just do that, because she's not been able to do that the entire day. And so regularly what I'll do in the evenings is to either before we eat or afterwards, I'll get the kids out of the house. Most of the time I'll take them to a local park of some sort, try to get them tired, but just get them out, burn off some of that energy, and then get them home, hopefully get them into bed. Caroline appreciates that, deeply appreciates that. And so she is glad to see me pulling out of the driveway with 4 kids in the van. However, it doesn't always work like that. Sometimes what will happen is that Nathan, our oldest, will say, I don't want to go to the park. Mommy, I want to stay here with you. Well, Caroline doesn't want to be a mom that says, no, I don't want you with me. And so what she'll do is to say something like this. I'll tell you what, Nathan, you can stay with me, but there's no TV. What you're going to do is clean, and when you finish, you'll go in your room and read. So on one side, we've got merry-go-rounds and sliding boards and running and hollering and jumping and all that. On this side, we have cleaning and reading. Now, what's she doing? She's gambling. She's betting on the fact that when faced with these options, he's going to choose not to stay with her, but to come with me. That's what she's betting. A lot of times it works. A lot of times it works. But sometimes, even much to her momentary dislike, he decides, you know what? I'm going to stay and clean and read. She'll gamble. A lot of times she'll win, but sometimes she loses. Satan, very similarly, is gambling. And he's gambling and betting big on making your circumstances terrible, putting you on your own personal griddle and turning the heat up, betting big on the fact that you're going to get to the point where you question God, that you doubt His goodness, that you doubt His promises, that you doubt His ability, that you overlook His blessings, that you overlook His provision, that you do all of this and get to the point where you question Him to the degree and you're disillusioned to the degree that maybe, just maybe, and what He's banking on is that you will walk away. The truth is, there's a lot of times throughout the course of history He's gotten it right. But sometimes He bets big and loses. The devil lost with Jochebed. He lost big time. As chapter 2 unfolds, and you're probably, as Paul Harvey said, aware of the rest of the story, she puts this little baby in this raft, and lets go. She trusts God with her little boy. And this little raft drifts in the river, seemingly aimlessly, but it comes over to the bank where the Pharaoh's daughter is bathing. And she sees this little raft containing this little boy, and she takes him out, and his life is spared. This little boy is given the name Moses. In fact, they need a child. They need someone, recently delivered mother, to serve as the wet nurse. And Moses' own mother serves as his wet nurse. Ain't that something? But this little boy, Moses, you remember what happens to him. God elevates him and leads him to the point where he leads the children of Israel out of slavery, out of Egypt, towards the promised land. Moses becomes the one that God uses to guide his people. It's to Moses that God uses this man to give the law to, greeting him up on Mount Sinai and giving to him the Ten Commandments. Moses becomes this great lawgiver to the Lord's people. Beyond that, he's the one that leads them all the way to the promised land. He wrote the first 5 books of the Old Testament. The devil bet. He gambled. He bet big against Jochebed, and he lost. He lost big. This is what I want you to recognize. He lost with Jochebed. That story has been written. Those events are now sealed. The question is he going to lose against you? He lost with Jochebed. Will he lose against you? I want you to bow your heads with me.